Right, good afternoon, welcome back. I'm going to talk as briefly as I can about the UKPSF and fellowship arrangements. There's a lot of development going on here to try and work out how to align your internal recognition scheme with the UKPSF and fellowship categories. I'm going to give you very much an overview. A couple of caveats. First thing is, I am in no way an official representative of the Higher Education Academy of AdvanceHE. I'm not representing UKPSF, I'm not representing fellowship. I have authored recognition programs and I've written postgraduate certificates to enable academics to achieve fellowship recognition at various categories, and I am myself a principal fellow. But just to be absolutely clear, there is no official representative method being advocated or any particular structure that you have to adhere to. These are my thoughts and my ideas. So the first thing is to make a clear distinction between the UKPSF and fellowship recognition. UKPSF developed in the mid-2000s. Its latest iteration is still 2011. We're going to go through it in some detail. Essentially, it aligns itself to the categories, or rather the categories of fellowship align to UKPSF. They use the UKPSF to leverage the various descriptors, and I'll come to that in a moment, but they are two quite distinct entities in the higher education sector. And there are certainly some international developments to take the UKPSF, to drop the UK, to talk about PSF, Professional Standards Framework, and deploy it in various different international contexts, and we might come back to that a bit later. I just want to run through what the UKPSF actually looks like. There are three dimensions of practice: core knowledge, areas of activity, and professional values. And each one is broken down. I'm going to run through them. I know there is someone here who would like me to read through the categories, so I'm going to do that. The elements, I'm going to read them out loud. You do have a printed version of this in front of you, that you've got a copy of everything I'm going to show you, so you can be referring to them as I walk through them. So let's focus on core knowledge. Clearly key one, so knowledge one, or K1 is the subject matter. K2 is appropriate methods for teaching and learning in the subject area and at the level of the academic programme. So we're going to come back a little bit later, I think in workshops later, about teaching to particular levels. K3 is how students learn, both generally and within their subject or disciplinary area. That's an acknowledgement that there are very particular disciplinary foci, and you do have an opportunity to evidence that. There's not a generic body, there is no canonical literature that tells you exactly how you have to teach. That's part of the challenge. K4 is the use and value of appropriate learning technologies. It is not in any way an advocacy that you have to use fancy learning technologies, but to recognise where they do have value and how to use them appropriately. Methods for evaluating the effectiveness of teaching. Clearly most organisations, as you do, peer observation systems in place, but there are lots of other opportunities, and we'll come to those as well this afternoon. And then the implications of quality assurance and quality enhancement for academic and professional practice, with a particular focus on teaching. Clearly quality assurance and quality enhancement, the relationship between those two is key. And there's a lot of discussion going on across the sector as to how we put quality enhancement very much on the front foot in that conversation. But clearly using quality assurance procedures provides a lot of support for people's practice. If you've got good assurance, quality guidelines, and they should raise the quality, the enhancement of people's professionalism. So those are the core knowledge components. There are then a number of areas of activity. So A1 is design, plan, learning activities and or programs of study. Now, the learning activities means that essentially you might literally only be responsible for half a module or for 2 weeks in a module. You may be part-time, you may be an occasion, you may be a guest lecturer. You can still meet that criteria. You don't have to be designing an entire module or program. Teach and support learning. To assess and give feedback to learners. And again, if you're a fractional contract member of staff and you're working just occasionally, you may not be formally assessing, but we can broaden the definition of assessment to provide all formative assessment, diagnostic assessment, synoptic assessment, all other forms of assessment. And you should be providing feedback throughout your teaching. So I would argue anyone who's teaching should be able to generate evidence for this. Clearly, it's very often interpreted in a very conservative way as to what formal feedback you give on summative work, but I think we can broaden that definition. A4's develop effective learning environments and approaches to student support and guidance. The first part of that is very often matched with K4, appropriate learning technologies, matching up with effective learning environments, but it can also just literally mean the way that you manage the classroom, and peer observation is clear evidence for that. And appropriate student support and guidance might be some of your tutorial activities as well as your in-class support for individual learners or groups of learners in your engagement with them. A5, engage in continuing professional development in subjects and disciplines and their pedagogy, incorporating research, scholarship and evaluation of professional practices. We can get into an alternative conversation about the meaning of pedagogy. I know people get very aggravated about the use of pedagogy when we're talking about adults. I think andragogy is equally invalid as a term these days. But we'll defer that conversation to another time. The important element here is that it's about continuing professional development. So you are continually developing yourselves as related to both your learning and teaching practice, but also importantly within your discipline. Even if your discipline is education or educational development or academic development, you need to be developing yourself continuously. So those are the areas of activity, 5 areas of activity. And then professional values, which I think are really at the foundation. Arguably they ought to really come first. Most representations put them in this order. V1 is respect individual learners and diverse communities. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. Promote participation in higher education and equality of opportunity for learners. Very much part of the widening participation agenda. Use evidence-informed approaches and outcomes from research, scholarship and continuing professional development. So very often academics, certainly who are not working in the educational domain as a discipline, sometimes think this is an unnecessary research, this evidence-based practice stuff. But if you think about it, your own activities, your own professional activity will be continuously generating all kinds of meaningful evidence. Everything you do in the classroom effectively amounts to evidence. Whether it's good or bad practice, evidence is debatable, but it is all evidence. And finally, acknowledgement of the wider context in which higher education operates, recognising the implication for professional practice. I think what I want to just say in the context of the professional values is this is where the PSF is arguably somewhat culturally ignorant. It doesn't necessarily recognise the very unique cultural context in which certain colleagues work in. There is no, if you take this to New Zealand, for example, there is no acknowledgement of the value of the Treaty of Waitangi. If you take this to Australia, there is no recognition of Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous peoples. And I would argue that that lack of foregrounding of people's epistemological frameworks is a weakness. You can generate evidence that supports those arguments under respecting individual learners. If you work with very diverse communities, Indigenous communities, you would hopefully be evidencing that through respecting individual learners and obviously acknowledging the wider context in which higher education operates. But it's a little bit that I would be happier if it was more self-evident, if it was foregrounded to some extent. But that, again, that might be something we want to discuss later in the week.